Hi, this is Rob from Cumulus Cycles. In this bonus video in the Bootstrap tutorial series, I'll walk you through refactoring this website, which I created at the end of the HTML and CSS tutorial playlists, to incorporate the Bootstrap CSS framework. Now, let's get started and convert our site from this to this. So jumping into VS Code, I'll start out by adding all the Bootstrap include files to the HTML pages in our site. I'll add the meta tag for the viewport, the link for the Bootstrap CSS file, and the link for the Bootstrap JavaScript file. Then if we go back to the browser, we'll see our page on the left is changed from this to this. So we know the Bootstrap styles have been applied. Now let's move on to our customization. So I'll start out by replacing our existing nav with a nav that uses Bootstrap classes. I've given the element the Bootstrap classes of navbar, navexpand medium, navbar dark with a dark background and a border of 4. The navbar content itself is wrapped in a fluid container, and the links to the login and register pages are wrapped in a navbar collapse. So if we save this code and then go back to the browser, we see our Bootstrap navbar has been applied. And if I resize this, the navbar turns into a Bootstrap hamburger icon, and we can access the login and register links from here. Going back to the code, one change that I'm going to make is to contain the header, the footer, and the main content area within an HTML main element. So I'll add the open and close element tags and change the old main elements to a section. Then inside the header, I'll give the h1 a class of display 5 with a font weight of bold, and I'll add the image fluid image thumbnail classes from Bootstrap to the image element. And if we go back to the browser, we'll see the page has now changed from this to this. But doing a comparison of the two Bootstrap pages, our new one on the left to the example on the right, we could tell that the layout of the page on the left is off. So I'm going to go back to the code, and in the main, I'm going to add a Bootstrap class of container and a Bootstrap container fluid. These classes will wrap the main content area. So I'll just jump down here and close them, save the page, go back to the browser, and our layout is looking much better. Back in VS Code, I'm going to replace the content in the main elements primary section with a div of a class of row, which contains a div of a class of call. And this will hold a paragraph with the main text on the page. Then there'll be another row with a single call with a button to the login page. If we save this and look at it in the browser, our page is continuing to look better. The last change I'm going to make to the code on this page is to add some Bootstrap classes to the footer, which will add some padding, some margin, it'll mute the text, add a border to the top, and align the text to the right of the footer. Saving this and going back to the browser shows that we've repositioned the content in the footer. Now, before we move on to another page, let's grab our code, validate, and with the exception of the warning, which we're going to ignore because I don't want to add a header to my section, our code passes validation. Now, moving over to the register page, we clearly have some work to do with our Bootstrap styles. But I noticed that the links have a text decoration of underline, and I really don't want those. So I'm going to jump back into our code, go into the style CSS in the CSS folder, and paste in a single style, which will target the HTML anchor elements and set the text decoration to none. If I save this and go back to the browser, now we see that style has been applied, and we can move on to applying our Bootstrap styles to this page. We'll start by refactoring our nav to what we applied in the home page, and we'll reposition our main element, and then we'll change the old main element to a section. Then we need to jump up to the main and wrap these elements in a container, then jump down and close the elements. Moving to the header, we'll replace the content with the same content that we added on the home page. And while we're here, we'll add the classes to the footer. Let's jump back in the browser and see how this looks. Okay, this page is really starting to take shape. Now we can move our attention to the form. First, I'll replace the existing div, which contains the content for the email address field, with HTML elements with Bootstrap classes applied. So now, the email address field and its label will be wrapped within a row and a call. I'll do the same for the password confirmation, and the form buttons. Let's go back to the browser, and now we have a Bootstrap form. If we look at the form on the right, and I try and register, we see that we have Bootstrap form validation applied. If I click the register button here, We only have standard HTML browser validation. So let's jump back into the code and apply Bootstrap validation to our form. I'll add a div with a class of invalid feedback and a validation message to the email element. I'll add the same to the password and password confirmation. I also need to jump up to the form and add the needs validation class with a no validate attribute. If we save this and go back to the browser and click the register button, we see that we're taken directly to the login page. The validation didn't work. This is because in order for Bootstrap validation to work, we need to include some JavaScript. So let's go back to VS Code and do that. Now, as mentioned in the Bootstrap tutorial series, I know we haven't covered JavaScript up to this point, but the JavaScript that we're going to add is the sample code from the Bootstrap form validation page, and it's enough to get us started. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over into our project folder and create a new folder called JS. And inside of it, I'm going to create a new file called validate.js. And I'll paste this code in. Now, we don't really need to worry too much about understanding the code at this point. It's just enough to know that this is code that will provide the form validation functionality in Bootstrap. Now, in order to include this in the register page, we need to add a script tag that points to the validate.js file in the JS folder. Now let's save this and go back to the browser. And if we click register here, now we have our Bootstrap form validation. Now let's move over to the login page, jump back into the code, and apply similar changes to that page that we applied to the register page. So I'll start by updating the nav and the new format for the main section, then close the elements at the bottom of the page. Since we know we're going to need form validation on this page, I'll include the new validate.js file as well. We'll add the classes to the form element, then update the form components. We'll save the page and go back to the browser, and now we have our login form with form validation. And that finally brings us to the contacts page. So let's jump back into the code and modify our starting elements. And if we jump back in the browser, we see our page is starting to take shape, and all we need to do now is add the elements for the contacts. Now, in the code for this page, I purposely deleted the existing elements for the contact data, because we're going to refactor those elements enough that it makes sense to start from scratch. So, for each contact on the page, we'll display the data inside of a Bootstrap card. So we have a div with a class of card. We include the image for the contact and give it a class of card image top. The main content in the card will be wrapped in a div with a class of card body. The contact's name will be in an h5 element with a class of card title, and then we'll provide the information for email address and phone. If we save this and go back to the browser, we'll see we have our first contact displayed. Now let's add the elements for the next two contacts. The next two contacts will also be enclosed in a div with a class of call, but they'll be wrapped inside of the div with the class of row. So here's our row with our three divs. Each div has a class of call medium 4, so each card containing the information for a single contact will take up 1/3 of the row. So if we save this and go back to the browser, we now have our first row with 3 contacts. Now let's add the other 2 rows with the remaining contacts. So here I'll add the row with the 3 divs of call, each containing a card with the elements for the appropriate contact. Add the final row, save the code, and go back to the browser, and now our My Contacts page is finished. And because we applied the Bootstrap CSS framework and the appropriate classes, the page is also responsive. So that concludes this demo on adding Bootstrap to a website. I hope you enjoyed following along, and I also hope to see you in another web development tutorial playlist on the Cumulus Cycles channel.